Hey guys, welcome back to Social Studies. So, a few weeks ago we started learning about World War I. It was also called the Great War. And now we're going to jump about 20 years in the future and talk a little bit about World War II. But before we do that, I'm going to explain a little bit about what happened in those 20 years between World War I and World War II. Alright, so if you'll remember, the war ended in 1918, and the next decade was called the 1920s. It was nicknamed the Roaring Twenties because America's factories were roaring again. They came back to life once everybody came back from the war. So, America's factories stopped making things for the war, and they eventually started making things that we needed that did not have to do with war. So men came back from war and they were able to go back to work, back to factories and different jobs that they had before. So many inventions were created during this time. One of those was the washing machine. So before the washing machine, a person had to take their dirty clothes, put them in soapy water, and scrub them on a scrub board. And this caused them to have sores on their knuckles. They'd get kind of bloody, and it was just messy work. And so some wonderful person decided that they wanted to change that, and they invented the washing machines that we have today. Alright, so that was one invention that was from the 20s. But another one was the vacuum cleaner. That was also created in the 20s. And it helped for women to clean the floors, just as we do today. So normally floors were just swept with a broom, and they had to take rugs outside and beat them with the stick to get the dirt out of them. But it was a lot easier for them to just take a vacuum and quickly take the vacuum over it, and it was done. They didn't have to take the rugs outside and beat all the dirt out of them. So vacuums were a great invention that was created in the 1920s as well. So these two inventions that were created could be used by people who had electricity in their houses at this time, and it made their lives a lot easier. As I mentioned before, men came back from the war and they went back to their normal jobs. So some of them went back to the jobs they had before. Some of them got new jobs as well. So some of them worked in offices, some of them worked in factories. And the factories were making new things. So they weren't making things for war anymore. They were making these new inventions like the vacuum and the washing machine. So some of them also made cars as well. So some popular cars during this time were made by Henry Ford. So some of you might recognize his last name because Ford cars are still around now. So Ford vehicles were very popular, and so were Chevrolets and Oldsmobiles, if you know what those are. And also in rural America, so not where the cities were, but where the farmland was, a lot of farming was going on. So if people in the war were farmers before, they would go back to their farm and continue farming. And most men found it pretty easy to find jobs when they came home from war. So, remember in World War I, who had to take over the jobs in America when the men left? It was the women, right? And a lot of women actually went on to marry men who had come back from war. So it was a lot of single women who took over the jobs. And a lot of them married men, soldiers who came back from war. And then they became housewives and used these new inventions. But some women didn't marry right away, and they wanted to stay in the jobs that they had when they were doing them during wartime. And so some of these jobs included being nurses and teachers, secretaries, or telephone operators. So not all women were housewives during this time. Another invention that wasn't created in the 20s but became very popular to have in your home was a radio. Okay, so a radio came in handy because you could get news from all over the world. You could also hear sermons that were preached every Sunday. So families, for entertainment, would sit around and listen to the radio, whatever was on, music or sermons or what have you. And that was a very popular thing to do in the 20s, and now they had time to do that because they weren't working long hours in factories, they weren't at war, and so they could finally have some leisure time, time to do fun things that they wanted to do. So these other things for leisure included going to see a baseball game, going sightseeing, going and look at God's creation, and boxing, listening to jazz and classical music, and attending plays. All right, so those were some of the things that they did while they had some free time finally, after a long, hard jobs working during war. All right, and let's talk about big cities in the 20s now. So big cities were, during this time, there was a lot of organized crime and violence. This means criminals worked together to break the law. And in places like Chicago, many criminals worked together to do this. The leader, his name was Al Capone, and these criminals sold illegal alcohol and helped people gamble and helped commit other crimes together. So it was organized, but it was crimes, okay? And during the 20s, Al Capone represented crime. So he was well known, and he was basically the leader of all of this. And then finally in the 1930s, Al Capone was arrested. So although the 20s was a time of prosperity and rest for a lot of people, not everything was perfect. Americans had problems, and especially in the cities we see. So in the late 1919, the 18th Amendment became law. So this amendment to the Constitution made making, transporting, and selling any alcoholic beverage illegal. So this was called prohibition, and to prohibit something means to forbid it. You can't do it. And since the 1800s, many Americans wanted prohibition. They didn't want alcohol to be legal in the United States. So they knew that drinking alcohol could lead to drunkenness, which is a sin, we're told in the Bible. And drunkenness is often led to injuries or crime. And so that was their thinking behind banning this. So many Americans hoped that stopping people from drinking alcohol would solve the problem of drunkenness and in turn would create less crime in cities. But some Americans did not obey this law. So they bought alcoholic drinks illegally, and they would sell alcoholic drinks made by the criminals, and the criminals would make a lot of money through this. And the 18th Amendment did not work perfectly. So prohibition did maybe prevent some suffering from drunkenness there, but it wasn't perfect, and it didn't last very long. All right, another key thing from the 1920s was called women's suffrage. And it sounds like women's suffering, but that's not exactly what it means. So it means, suffrage means the right to vote. So women, up until this point, did not vote a lot of times. They weren't allowed to. It was a little bit different for each different place in the United States. So states had different rules depending on where you lived for voting, women voting. So most states in the West allowed women to vote whenever men could. And in the Midwest region of the United States, women could vote for president only. And then in the South and the East, women were never allowed to vote. So the 19th Amendment to the Constitution passed soon after World War II, and it promised women the right to vote. So no one could stop women from voting at this point. It was perfectly legal for women to vote. So now, because of the new inventions that were coming out in the 1920s, people were spending a lot of money to get the newest and greatest things that were out there. They were spending lots of money, and because of this, the economy was thriving. So people were spending money, people were getting a lot of money from this, and people were encouraged to buy things through advertising. So people would see a poster maybe of the newest, greatest vacuum cleaner and say, well, my neighbor has this vacuum cleaner. I feel like I need this vacuum cleaner too. So that's what advertising started out doing, and we still have advertising. We have commercials, especially on TV. If you see something cool that you want, you'll say, "Oh, Mom, I want that. Can I have that, please, for Christmas or something?" So that's what advertising does. And advertising agencies try to convince people that they need more things. They suggested that no housewife would be happy without the newest vacuum cleaner, and every man needed the newest razor for their face, right? So people kept buying things, and businesses kept making lots and lots of money off of this. So on Wall Street, where people did business in the stock market, seemed like it was fine, right? So there was a lot of good things happening. People were buying stocks in big companies because those companies were making a lot of money, so their stockholders were making a lot of money as well. But actually, not everything was fine. People had bought a lot of new things that they wanted, but people also borrowed a lot of money, and then the people that they borrowed from would take that money and then use it on other things, and some people borrowed money to buy stocks, and in 1929, people stopped buying all of these things. So people would still buy a few things, but they didn't need the latest and greatest thing, because who needs 15 vacuum cleaners, right? So buying slowed down a lot during this time. So people didn't really want to buy anything anymore, and prices for goods, when they're not needed, the price goes down a lot. And the prices for stocks were falling too, because people weren't buying as much. So it's kind of like how right here in quarantine, people freaked out about toilet paper and bought up all the toilet paper, and now it's a necessity and a need, and they can bring the prices up a lot because people will pay a lot of money for it. So that's kind of how it happened. And there was this day called Black Tuesday, and it's the nickname for October 29th in 1929, and it affected all Americans across the board. So many of these people had bought stocks. Now stocks were worth very little because people weren't buying as much, so the people that bought into the company were losing money. And some banks had bought stocks with their investors' money, and these investors lost the money because they thought it was safe. And with less money, people bought fewer things. Factories made less cars. Workers lost their jobs because nobody wanted the things that they were making anymore. And there wasn't a demand for the goods that they were making. So Black Tuesday became a hard time in America's history, and it created something called the Great Depression. And the Great Depression is what we had in the 1930s, all right? So the decade after the 20s. So jumping a decade now. Okay, so when people heard that the banks invested their money and they might not be able to get it back, people started to do what was called a bank run. And it sounds exactly like what it sounds like. It is exactly what it sounds like. So people were running to the banks to pull their money out before the bank ran out of money to give to people. So it's kind of like this. When your parents put money in a bank, those specific bills that they give the cashier don't actually stay there. The bank keeps a record of how much your parents have in their account, but those bills might not be given exactly back to them. They might be given to somebody else who wants to withdraw money to go buy something. But the bank makes sure they keep a running tab of how much your parents have in their account. So if they ever wanted to take out, say, all of their money, they could give them all of their money back. So these people went to the bank to get their money out quickly, but the bank didn't have enough bills to give them, and so these people lost all of their money, or a lot of people lost all of their money. So this caused people to not have enough food, or not enough money to buy food or other necessities. So farmers were growing food that people didn't have enough money to buy, and eventually it went to waste. And eventually the government had to actually pay farmers to stop growing food because it was just going to waste. So in certain fields, maybe farmers would only grow corn in 1 or 2 of their fields, and they left the other 6 fields that they had bare. So they'd be growing just enough corn for people to buy and not an excess or too much corn. All right. So eventually, the event that got the American economy rolling again is what you're going to read about this week, World War II. Okay? So this starts on page 259, and we are going to start from there. You guys are going to read by yourself this week because you are almost 5th graders. I can't even fathom that. The year has gone by so fast. I wish we could have been together during 4th quarter, but you guys are doing great so far. I really appreciate the effort that you guys are putting in doing your schoolwork, and I hope to see you soon. All right? Have a great week, guys.